Right, so I want to talk a little bit now about some of the cognitive elements of anxiety. So the thoughts that go through our head, perhaps the point where it all kicks off, something that we think about or we worry about. So I just want to talk a little bit about the mind now and how the mind works. Most people think that they're fairly reasonable and sensible people, and if they have a thought that actually it's an important thing for them to pay attention to. They're sensible people, they have sensible thoughts. Unfortunately, I'm here to tell you it's not actually the case. The mind does send out a lot of useful and helpful thoughts, but it also sends out quite a lot of things that are really a lot of nonsense and actually are just things like anxious thoughts that aren't very helpful and don't add anything to our lives. So what I want to do is just think a little bit like, what is the brain like? Well, the brain is a little bit like a sushi belt. If you've ever been to Yo Sushi in England, or if you've ever been to sushi where you have food coming around on a belt, I want you to imagine it's a little bit like that, and the mind is the sushi chef in the kitchen making the food and the dishes. Now, we have lots of thoughts that come out throughout the day. Some of them very sensible, must pick up a pint of milk later on, or must call my friend later on. These are really useful and helpful thoughts, but they're also not very emotional. So as they come out on that belt, we see them coming out, and yet they come round and then they can go past us and we feel okay about it. We don't really want the dish, it's not very interesting, but we do let that thought pass us by. Now we have something like an anxious thought, a thought that really grabs our attention, a really sticky dish, one of our favourite dishes that we think a lot of. That thought could be anything. It could be people will think I'm weird, or what if my partner dies tomorrow if I don't do this ritual. It could be anything. These anxious thoughts that come out that we think a lot about. So out they come, out onto the sushi belt, our favourite dishes. And what it does is it draws our attention, and as it comes round, we take that dish. We think that's my favourite dish, I'm going to have that. Now what happens at that point is the brain in the kitchen is thinking supply and demand. That was a very popular dish, let's send some more of it out. So what we get is we get another anxious thought coming out, maybe the same one that comes round, or maybe it's slightly different or a variation on the theme. And round that comes, and we take that dish, and of course then it continues on, and we have lots and lots of dishes. Before we know it, we've got loads and loads of anxious thought. Now, anxiety being the nature that it is not a moderate animal. When we do have an anxious thought, it doesn't just stay at something that's a little bit worrying. It goes further and further and further and further along. So it gets more and more extreme the more we attend to it. And this is a very important point. There are two things that happen when we have a repeated thought, or a thought that we attend to. Anything we attend to, any thought we have, the more we attend to it, the bigger and the more frequent that thought is likely to become. And that's very important to think about. But there's a second thing that happens, which is the more we have a thought, the more believable it becomes as well. So these are two really important things. We have to be very careful about what we attend to. So say I leave my house today and I close the door and I'm halfway up the street and I think, did I lock the door? Now, did I lock the door? I'm not sure I did lock the door. Now that makes me anxious and worried as I start to think about it more. And as I start to think about it, extends that thought. I begin to think, what if someone breaks in? What if they take this or take that belonging to me? I begin to expand the thought, and the more I think it, the more concerned and anxious I'm becoming. But something else is also happening. The more I'm thinking about it, the more I'm believing it's a possibility. So that any thought we have, the more we attend to it, the more believable it becomes. And before you know, I can't stand it anymore. I've got to go back and check the door. I go back, the door is locked. Yeah. So there's something happening in the process of thought. We get convinced by our own thoughts. And what that means for anxiety and anxious thought is that we've got to be quite careful how much airplay we allow these anxious thoughts, because the more we attend to them, the more we get of them, and the more believable they become. It actually doesn't make any difference to the outcome. There's no more risk associated with these anxious thoughts. It's just that we believe that the anxious thought is more likely to happen. So I think that's quite an important thing. What do we do about this? Well, we have to use this information to try and draw our mind away from the thought. If we've got a reoccurring anxious thought, it's not a reasonable thought. It's not a thought that is quite sensible. It's a thought that we're always having and we're always worrying about it. If we can get our mind to spend less time on it, chances are we're going to feel less anxious. How do we do that is the question. Well, there are various techniques that we would need to develop, and one of the most useful, and I use a lot in my practice, is something called mindfulness, which you may have heard about, and if I have time I will do some videos on, but if you can find somewhere where you can go to learn mindfulness, perhaps with other people even, it's a really useful thing, because what it allows you to do is to observe your mind, notice the sushi belt and the different thoughts coming out of it, and for you to begin to develop a skill in discerning which thoughts you pay attention to and which ones you refuse to think about, and you draw your mind away from the sushi belt. But in order to do that, you have to have a really strong muscle to pull the mind away from the sushi belt. We have to be able to have a nice strong kind of mental muscle to do that. And in order to develop those muscles of our mind, we need to practice them, and that's where mindfulness comes into its own. I don't have time to go into it today, but if you're very interested, and I certainly will talk about that more, because it is important. I will go on to talk a little bit more about the nature of thought in the next video, and thinking about future projection and past projections, because these are where our mind wanders to, because that's quite important too in realising how anxiety works. That's going to be the next video.